Everyone in Chicago knew the ironclad rule. You did not look Julian Moretti in the eye. It was an invitation to oblivion, and you never, under any circumstance, approached his table. But on that sodden, miserable night at Giovanni's, the suffocating silence of organized respect was violently shredded by a noise that was not the sound of final pain. It was a scream from a baby that was not only crying but aggressively refusing to cease. The entire, exclusive restaurant, filled with the city's most important and fearful people, collectively held its breath as the patience of the Mafia dawn finally snapped. Then, one woman, a struggling single mother who had already run out of options and fear, slowly rose to her feet. She walked deliberately past the hulking, armed guards and committed the unthinkable trespass. She didn't beg for mercy or offer supplication. She stood over the table and scolded the devil himself. What followed didn't just break the rules of the Chicago underworld. It ignited a devastating war. Outside, the November rain hammered relentlessly against the stained glass windows of Giovanni's, Chicago's most exclusive Italian fortress. But inside, the air was so static and still it felt less like a vacuum and more like a compression chamber, pressing down on every breath. It was November 14th, a Tuesday, the kind of night where the heavy, wounded city seemed bruised and profoundly angry. Sarah Bennett was tucked away in a shadowed corner booth, nursing a glass of lukewarm water, the condensation long gone. She knew she shouldn't be there. She couldn't afford the water, much less the rotto pasta the couple across the room was ignoring. At 26, she wore a coat that had been visibly mended 3 times, and she was staring intently at an empty chair. The lawyer she had scraped every last cent of her savings together to meet, a Mr. Henderson, was now 40 minutes late. He was meant to be her final, desperate hope for retaining full custody of her 4-year-old daughter, Lily, against an ex-husband who measured his worth in dollar bills, not decency. Mr. Henderson wasn't coming. She felt the definitive, crushing certainty of it in her bones. Just as the icy despair began to claw at her throat, the atmosphere in the restaurant underwent a sudden, terrifying transformation. It wasn't merely a sound. It was a physical drop in the surrounding air pressure. The heavy, cathedral-like oak doors swung open, and 4 men entered, moving with a silent, predatory coordination. The maitre d', a man who usually regarded state senators with thinly veiled contempt, practically bowed himself to the floor. "Mr. Moretti, we have your table ready." Julian Moretti. Even Sarah, whose entire existence revolved around keeping her head down and remaining invisible, knew that name. The respectable newspapers referred to him euphemistically as a shipping magnate. The streets, however, whispered a different title, the Capo di Capi. He was immensely tall, dressed in a charcoal suit tailored with an unnerving precision that surely cost more than Sarah's total lifetime earnings. His face was a chiseled mask of cold, sharp angles, his dark eyes ceaselessly scanning the room, hunting for potential threats. But in his arms, clutched awkwardly and held slightly away from the perfection of his expensive suit, was a soft bundle wrapped in luxurious blue cashmere. A baby. The sight was so fundamentally jarring that Sarah blinked hard, ensuring she hadn't hallucinated it. The most dangerous, lethal man in Chicago was holding an infant like it was a complex explosive device he possessed absolutely no idea how to disarm. They took the central table for the undisputed locus of power. The bodyguards silently took up staggered positions, their expensive jackets bulging conspicuously with the outline of heavy weaponry. The restaurant fell into a state of total, unnatural silence. Forks froze mid-air. Conversations vanished, strangled in mid-sentence. Then the inevitable began. A pathetic little whimper at first, then a mournful wail, escalating rapidly into a full-blown, lung-shredding, terrifying scream. The baby was deeply, profoundly distressed. Julian Moretti stiffened instantly. He began jiggling the child roughly, his expression cycling through cold indifference, genuine panic, and finally settling into a simmering, volcanic rage. "Marco." Julian snapped the name at the man seated to his right. "Make it stop." "Boss, I don't know how." Marco stammered, his terror palpable. The crying grew exponentially louder, a piercing shriek of pure, agonizing discomfort that scraped at the nerves of every diner. The other patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but not a single soul dared to meet the capo's gaze. The tension in the room wasn't just palpable. It was a physical weight, crushing the air out of the lungs. Everyone could feel the raw, contained violence radiating off Julian. He was losing control, and a man like Julian Moretti despised, above all else, losing control. "Get the car," Julian hissed, standing abruptly. The baby arched his tiny back, screaming even harder. Julian's already tight grip tightened further, clearly too tight. Sarah felt a sharp, painful pull in her chest cavity. It was the biological override, the mother's primal instinct, bypassing all logic, social convention, and self-preservation. She watched the man's massive hand gripping the infant's fragile ribcage. He was hurting the child, not out of malice, but out of sheer, overwhelming incompetence and frustrated fury. She didn't pause to think. She didn't consider the guns pointed in her direction, the custody battle that hung over her head, or the devastating fact that she was a complete nobody facing Chicago royalty. Sarah stood up. Her worn heels clicked sharply on the polished marble floor. The sound was deafening, like a lone gunshot in the absolute silence. One of the bodyguards, a massive slab of a man with a brutal scar slicing through his eyebrow, moved instantly, stepping directly into her path. His hand dipped instinctively inside his jacket. "Sit down, lady," he growled, the command low and lethal. "Move," Sarah commanded. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was unervingly steady. "He's holding the baby wrong. He's going to bruise him." The bodyguard blinked, momentarily stunned by her sheer, suicidal audacity. In that minuscule fraction of confusion, Sarah sidestepped his bulk. She walked right up to table 4, right up to the devil himself. Julian Moretti swung his dark, lethally focused gaze onto her. His eyes were like polished shards of ice. "Who are you?" he snarled. "Get back before I—" "You're pinching his diaphragm." Sarah cut him off, her own eyes locking unwaveringly onto his. She wasn't seeing the mob boss. She was seeing a deeply clueless, desperate father. "Look at his face. He's not hungry, he's gasping. Your panic is squeezing him." The entire restaurant seemed to collectively gasp. The staff watched in frozen horror, expecting her to be dragged out, humiliated, or simply shot on the spot. "Give him to me," Sarah commanded, her voice carrying an authority born of exhaustion and certainty. She held out her arms, empty but firm. It was the ultimate, unthinkable act, demanding custody of the Moretti Empire's heir. Julian looked from the violently screaming child to the woman in the frayed coat with the fierce, unyielding eyes. He was drowning in his own powerlessness, and she, inexplicably, looked like a fleeting life raft. Slowly, hesitantly, he transferred the screaming bundle into her outstretched arms. Sarah took the baby, Leo, she would later learn, and immediately shifted his position with expert economy. She rested him high on her shoulder, pressing his tummy gently against her collarbone, and began a rhythmic, firm, yet gentle pat on his back while swaying her hips in a familiar, soothing motion. "Sho, it's okay. You're okay." She hummed a low, chest-vibrating sound, transferring the comforting rhythm to the child. In 10 seconds, the screaming receded into frantic whimpers. In 20 seconds, the whimpers stopped entirely. In 30 seconds, the baby let out a long, shuddering, exhausted breath and fell immediately asleep. The silence that followed was heavier than before, a dense, palpable thing, but this time it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the crushing weight of pure, unimaginable shock. Sarah gently pulled the blanket away from the baby's face, checking his color and breathing. She looked up and found Julian Moretti staring at her. The icy veneer in his eyes had cracked, revealing something intensely proprietary and dangerously calculating beneath. "He has colic," Sarah whispered, handing the peacefully sleeping child back to the stunned father. "Burp him halfway through the feed, not just at the end. And loosen your tie. The silk fabric is scratching his cheek." She didn't wait for a thank you. The immense spike of adrenaline crashed, and the devastating realization of what she had just risked washed over her. She spun around, retrieved her purse from her booth, and stumbled out of the restaurant, her legs shaking so violently she could barely walk. She thought she had narrowly escaped. She thought that was definitively the end of it. She was terrifyingly wrong. Sarah didn't sleep that night. Every time her eyes closed, she saw the harsh outline of the handgun in the bodyguard's jacket. She sat vigilantly in her tiny, drafty apartment in the Englewood district, watching her own daughter, Lily, sleep deeply in her single bed. Lily was 4 years old. She was the absolute, radiant light of Sarah's life and the sole driving reason Sarah worked double shifts at a grimy diner and took on hazardous cleaning jobs on the weekends. But with her ex-husband, Gary, petitioning the court for full custody, citing her extreme financial instability and lack of resources, Sarah felt the walls closing in, suffocating her. Gary had a new, polished wife, a beautiful new suburban house, and a shark of a lawyer. Sarah had overdue rent notices and a recently broken toaster. The very next morning, Sarah was at the diner, lethargically wiping down the sticky counter. It was 10 a.m., the brief, weary lull after the breakfast rush. Betty, her manager, frantic and ghost-pale, hissed from the kitchen window. "Sarah, there are men outside for you." Sarah's heart seized in her chest. Gary, had he sent the police this quickly? She wiped her hands on her stained apron and walked slowly to the front entrance. 2 massive black SUVs were parked illegally at the curb, completely blocking the morning traffic flow. The same massive bodyguard from the night before, the one with the violent scar through his eyebrow, was standing by the door. This time, however, he wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was holding the door open. "Mr. Moretti requests your presence," the man stated, his tone flat and unyielding. It was not remotely a question. "I have a shift. I can't leave," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts. "We bought the diner," the man said conversationally, as if ordering coffee. "Your shift is concluded. Please, Miss Bennett." The boss has no patience for delay. They knew her name. Of course, they knew her name. Sarah walked toward the door and got into the waiting car. The drive north was silent and swift. They didn't go to some industrial warehouse or a dark, abandoned alley. They drove all the way north to the Gold Coast, pulling up to a towering limestone mansion that looked less like a home and far more like a heavily guarded museum. Massive iron gates swung open with mechanical precision, revealing a long driveway choked with luxury cars that Sarah couldn't even name. Inside, the house was cold, exquisitely beautiful, cripplingly expensive, and utterly devoid of any human warmth. Marble floors shone beneath modern art pieces that looked precisely like spilled ink, and oppressive silence reigned. She was escorted into a massive study. Julian Moretti was seated behind a sprawling mahogany desk, reviewing a document. He didn't look up immediately. "Sarah Bennett," he said, turning a page slowly. "Age 26, divorced, 1 daughter, Lily. Currently 3 months behind on rent in a substandard dwelling. Embroiled in a losing custody battle with Gary Bennett, a car salesman with a profound, hidden gambling problem. He conceals it well." Sarah felt profoundly violated, every fiber of her being exposed. "How do you know all that?" Julian finally looked up. Without the helpless weight of the baby in his arms, he was terrifying again, radiating coiled threat. "I know everything about people who touch my son." He stood up and walked around the vast desk. He held out a crisp, black envelope. "What is this?" Sarah asked, refusing to take the offering. "Severance pay for your diner job," Julian stated. "And an advance." "I don't understand. My son, Leo, hasn't stopped crying since his mother died 3 months ago. Nannies last maybe 2 days tops. Some quit, some I fire." Julian's jaw tightened visibly. "Last night was the first time he has slept for more than an hour. He likes you." Sarah stared at him, dumbfounded. "You want to hire me as a nanny?" "I want to hire you as a mother," Julian corrected softly. "Not to me but to him. I need someone who isn't paralyzed by fear of me, and who clearly knows exactly what she's doing. I can't. Sarah instinctively backed away, shaking her head. I know exactly who you are, Mr. Moretti. I can't bring my daughter into this world. I'm desperately trying to gain custody, not lose it because I'm associating with the Mafia. Julian smirked, a humorless, tight pull of his lips. Let's examine your current reality, Sarah. You have no resources and no lawyer. Your ex-husband has already bought off the sitting judge. Did you know he's going to seize Lily permanently on Friday morning? Sarah felt the blood drain entirely from her face, leaving her dizzy and cold. No, that's not true. It is. I checked thoroughly. Julian tossed the black envelope onto the table's surface. Inside that envelope is a certified check for $50,000. Enough to hire the best family law attorney in the entire state. And if you accept this job, you and Lily move in here. 24-hour personal security, a chef, a driver on standby, and absolutely no one, not Gary, not the judge, not even God himself, will ever take your daughter away from you. It was a deal struck directly with the devil. Sarah knew it down to her core. She looked at the check peeking out of the envelope. It was freedom from perpetual fear. It was absolute safety for Lily, but it was also undeniably a golden cage. What's the catch? She whispered, barely able to voice the question. Julian stepped closer, deliberately invading her personal space. She could faintly smell his expensive cologne, sandalwood, and high-grade tobacco. The catch is that once you are in, Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, territorial rumble. You live completely by my rules. You don't ask questions about my business dealings. You don't look into rooms that are locked and sealed. And you never leave this house without my explicit, direct permission. You belong to the family now. Sarah thought of Lily's smiling face. She thought of the certainty of Gary taking her away forever. I have one condition, Sarah stated, her voice surprisingly gaining sudden strength. Julian raised a finely sculpted eyebrow, momentarily surprised. You are in no position to bargain, Ms. Bennett. But humor me. I'm not just the nanny. I eat dinner with you. She met his gaze directly. If I'm living here, I'm not going to be hidden away in the servants' quarters while you play lord of the manor. I want my daughter to feel like this is a functional home, not a gilded prison. We eat at the table. Same food, same respect. Julian stared at her for a long, heavy moment. The tension in the study was electric, vibrating in the silence. He was fundamentally unaccustomed to receiving demands, especially from someone so clearly beneath him. Finally, a ghost of a genuine smile touched his lips, fleeting and dangerous. Dinner is at 7 o'clock, he said. Don't be late. Moving into the Moretti estate was an overwhelming experience, akin to moving into a vast, opulent mausoleum. The silence here was different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a library. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of profound secrets and constant surveillance. Sarah and Lily were given a luxurious suite in the East Wing. It was larger, by far, than Sarah's entire previous apartment complex. Lily, wide-eyed with awe and clutching her worn-out teddy bear, ran ecstatic circles on the enormous Persian rug, delighted by how miraculously soft it felt beneath her feet. But Sarah couldn't shake the unnerving feeling of being perpetually watched. The minimal staff moved like quiet, emotionless ghosts. They were relentlessly efficient, meticulously polite, and completely devoid of any discernible personality. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Galloway, was a woman in her 60s with a face that appeared to be carved from granite. She had looked at Sarah's cheap, scuffed suitcases with a subtle, yet withering, disdain that was almost artistically impressive. Mr. Moretti does not tolerate noise. Mrs. Galloway had warned them upon arrival, her voice brittle. He does not tolerate clutter, and the West Wing is strictly, unequivocally forbidden. Is that understood? Understood, Sarah had replied, though her eyes immediately drifted toward the heavy oak doors that served as the impenetrable barrier separating the West Wing from the main hall. The first inevitable challenge came that very afternoon. It was time for Leo's nap. Sarah walked into the nursery. It was a room ripped straight out of a high-end architectural magazine, All sterile whites, cold grays, and sleek, modern, unforgiving furniture. It was pristine, immaculate. It was also absolutely freezing. The air conditioning was blasting full force, and there wasn't a single soft toy in sight, only a crib that looked suspiciously like a minimalist cage. Leo was in the crib, staring up blankly at the high, white ceiling, making that low, heartbreaking whimpering sound again. Sarah immediately picked him up. His skin was cool and slightly clammy to the touch. "Oh, you poor little thing," she murmured, rubbing his arms vigorously. "No wonder you cry constantly. You're living in an icebox." She searched frantically for a thermostat. It was locked securely behind a plastic case. Sarah found Mrs. Galloway in the vast, echoing hallway. "I need the key to the nursery thermostat. It's far too cold in there. Mr. Moretti prefers the house temperature at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Keeps the art perfectly preserved," Mrs. Galloway said flatly, without pausing her meticulous dusting. "He's a baby, not a painting," Sarah snapped, her maternal fury bubbling over. "The key, now." Mrs. Galloway hesitated, then scoffed, her disdain evident. "You may be the nanny, Ms. Bennet, but you do not run this house." "No." A deep, dangerous voice rumbled down from the top of the grand staircase. "But she runs that room." Julian Moretti descended the steps. He had changed out of his suit into a black button-down shirt, the sleeves meticulously rolled up, revealing forearms that were thick with corded muscle and covered in the faint white tracery of old scars. Mrs. Galloway went instantly pale. "Sir, I was merely just—" "Give her the key," Julian commanded, not bothering to look at the trembling housekeeper. His dark eyes remained fixed entirely on Sarah. "And get the child a standalone heater until the system can be properly adjusted." Mrs. Galloway handed over the small brass key with trembling fingers and scurried away, vanquished. Julian walked up to Sarah. He was imposing, his physical presence easily filling the hallway. He looked down at Leo, who was now resting his head contentedly on Sarah's shoulder, utterly quiet. "You're good with him," Julian said, sounding almost accusatory, as if her competence was a personal affront. "He just needs warmth, Mr. Moretti. Babies need to feel like they aren't completely alone." Julian's jaw tightened. A heavy shadow passed briefly over his features. Grief, perhaps, or a crushing wave of guilt. "My wife, Isabella, she wanted the nursery to be perfect, modern, clean." "It's sterile," Sarah said, choosing honesty over caution. "He needs color. He needs soft, comforting things. I want to paint it." "Paint it?" Julian blinked slowly, absorbing the audacity. "Yes, a soft sage yellow or a calming green. And I want a proper rocking chair. A warm, wooden one, not that cold metal thing you have in there." Julian merely stared at her. No one, absolutely no one, made demands of the dawn. But then he looked down at his sleeping son, who was reaching out a tiny, instinctive hand to curl around a stray lock of Sarah's hair. "Do whatever you want," Julian said, finally turning away. "Just make sure he sleeps." That night, the first family dinner took place. The ornate dining room table was long enough to comfortably seat 20 people. Julian sat alone at the head. Sarah and Lily sat to his right, near the center. The emotional distance between them felt like insurmountable miles. Lily, usually a non-stop chatterbox, was intimidated into silence by the towering ceilings, the crystal chandeliers, and the silent, disapproving servers. She nervously picked at her spaghetti, which was gourmet truffle-infused, and not at all what a 4-year-old child typically enjoys. "Is the food not to your liking?" Julian asked. His voice was deep, startling Lily out of her reverie. Lily looked up, momentarily terrified by the sound. "It tastes like dirt," she whispered honestly. Sarah gasped, mortified. "Lily, it's truffles. It's very fancy food." Julian paused. He looked down at his own untouched plate. He took a slow, deliberate bite. "She's right," he conceded. "It tastes like dirt." He signaled the chef, who was hovering anxiously in the far corner. "Grilled cheese," Julian ordered, his tone decisive. "For the girl and for me as well." The French chef looked visibly horrified, but nodded quickly and fled the room. Lily giggled. It was a small, high sound, but it echoed clearly in the vast, still room. Julian looked at the little girl, and for the very first time, the hardness deep in his eyes softened, momentarily replaced by a flicker of tenderness. "Where is the baby's mommy?" Lily suddenly asked, swinging her legs beneath the table. Sarah froze, her breath catching. "Lily, we don't ask. She's in heaven," Julian answered. His voice was flat, unervingly devoid of any raw emotion. "Did she get sick?" Lily asked, completely oblivious to the intense tension radiating off the bodyguards standing by the door. "No," Julian said. He took a slow sip of dark red wine. "Bad men took her away." Sarah felt a sickening chill run down her spine. The reality of exactly where she was crashed back in with brutal force. This wasn't just a rich man's house. This was a fortress built on blood, loyalty, and relentless violence. "My daddy is a bad man," Lily stated matter-of-factly, reverting to the familiar. "He yells at mommy." He broke the toaster. Julian's gaze shifted instantly to Sarah. He studied a faint bruise on her arm that she had attempted, unsuccessfully, to cover with makeup. A final parting gift from Gary just a week ago when he had forcibly tried to shove his way into her apartment. Julian didn't utter a word. He just stared at the purple-yellow bruise until Sarah self-consciously pulled her sleeve down further. "Nobody will break your toasters here, Lily," Julian said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of an unbreakable vow. "I promise you that." The moment was violently interrupted by Marco, the head of security, who burst into the room without bothering to knock or apologize. "Boss, we have a serious problem at the docks. The Russians." Julian's face instantly snapped shut. The concerned father vanished entirely. The dawn was back, cold and lethal. He stood up, throwing his napkin carelessly onto the table. "Take them to their rooms," Julian ordered Marco without looking back at Sarah. "Lock the doors securely. No one comes in or out until I return." "Julian." Sarah stood up, the name slipping out before she could stop the reckless impulse. He paused at the doorway. He looked back over his shoulder, his eyes dark, penetrating, and profoundly dangerous. "Go to your room, Sarah, and forget what you hear tonight." He left. That night, Sarah didn't sleep at all. She held Lily on one side and the now quiet Leo on the other, both tucked into her enormous bed, listening to the alarming sounds of heavy cars speeding away, and later, the muffled, distant sound of shouting and heavy footsteps in the courtyard outside. She realized then that the golden cage, no matter how luxurious, was still definitively a cage, and the wolves were not only outside but scratching furiously at the door. 3 weeks crawled by. The rhythmic cadence of the house gradually began to change. The pristine nursery was no longer clinical white. Sarah had painted it a calming, soft sage green. There were now stuffed animals, a comfortable, worn wooden rocking chair, and a mobile of felt stars that she had meticulously made herself. Leo was now a remarkably different baby. He was gaining healthy weight. He smiled often. He slept soundly for long stretches. And Julian was changing, too. He was still characteristically cold, still immensely distant, often disappearing for days at a time on urgent business. But when he was home, he made a point of spending time in the nursery. He would stand silently in the doorway, merely watching Sarah rock Leo to sleep. Sometimes he would even sit quietly in the oversized armchair and just listen to her soft humming. One dreary, rainy Tuesday, Sarah was in the cavernous kitchen, attempting to teach the stiff, profoundly skeptical French chef how to make proper chocolate chip cookies for Lily. Flour was everywhere, dusting the marble countertops, coating the stainless steel appliances. Lily was shrieking with pure delight, her face smeared thickly with chocolate. Julian walked in. He was wearing a flawless, expensive tuxedo, clearly headed to an important gala. He stopped dead, staring in disbelief at the catastrophic mess in his pristine, museum-like kitchen. The chef looked ready to faint from terror. "Sir, I attempted to stop them." "It's fine," Julian interrupted. He walked deliberately over to the counter, dipped a single finger into the mixing bowl of batter, and tasted it. Needs more salt, he stated critically. Sarah let out a genuine, surprised laugh. She had actually laughed at the Mafia boss. Oh, now you're suddenly a culinary critic, are you? I know good food, Julian said easily. His eyes lingered on her face. She was wearing an old, flour-dusted t-shirt and jeans. Her hair pulled back into a messy, flyaway bun. And he was looking at her as if she were the single most captivating woman in the world. The air between them suddenly crackled with a dangerous, undeniable heat. I have a request, Julian said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a deep, suggestive rumble. Yes, the chaotic mess you've made of my kitchen. Clean it up, he said. The command was soft, almost conversational, but the smirk playing on his lips undercut any sincerity. The entire stainless steel kitchen, usually pristine, looked like a grenade of flour and sugar had gone off. And tomorrow, Julian continued, the pleasantry dropping entirely, I need you to come with me. Come with you where? Sarah asked, wiping dried chocolate from the back of her hand. I have a meeting, a negotiation. A sensitive one. It helps to have a softer presence. You will bring Leo. We will present the image of a stable, happy father. You want me to be a prop? Sarah asked, crossing her arms, the accusation sharp and direct. I want you to be my shield, Julian admitted, a rare moment of vulnerability flickering in his eyes before the iron mask returned. They won't shoot if there is a woman and child present. It's the code. Even they adhere to certain rules. That's comforting, Sarah said, dripping sarcasm into the word like acid. But she knew the necessity of the request, the grim reality of the world she now inhabited. She agreed. The meeting was held at a vineyard estate outside the city, a deceptive slice of pastoral beauty. The rolling hills were ablaze with the rich ochre and scarlet of autumn leaves, a perfect setting for a family outing. But the men sitting around the polished mahogany patio table were not tourists. They were predators, sleek and silent, sharks disguised in expensive wool suits. Sarah sat beside Julian, Leo resting quietly in her lap, bundled against the chill. She wore a simple navy dress Julian had purchased for her, nothing flashy, designed to project an image of demure respectability. She played the part perfectly, the attentive mother, the quiet partner, a silent pillar of domesticity. Across the table sat Luca Viti, the head of the rival family. He was older than Julian, his face etched with decades of brutal calculation, greasy, and his sparse remaining teeth were yellowed by decades of cheap tobacco. You look soft, Julian. Viti sneered, the words slithering out as he blew a thick plume of cigar smoke directly toward the baby. Sarah instinctively waved the noxious cloud away with her hand, glaring openly at the man. She was no longer performing. That was sheer maternal reflex. I look settled, Julian corrected, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded attention. There is a difference. And who is this? Viti gestured toward Sarah with the glowing tip of his cigar, his eyes raking over her without a trace of respect. The new flavor of the month. Is she? She's pretty. A bit skinny for my taste. Julian's hand, which had been resting loosely on the table, clenched into a fist. Sarah saw the knuckles turn bone white, a warning flash of the violence simmering beneath his composure. She is the mother of my son. Julian lied smoothly, the falsehood slipping out with effortless conviction. And you will speak to her with respect. Viti let out a rattling, phlegmy laugh that scraped at the quiet atmosphere. Or what? You'll start a war over a nanny? I've started wars for less, Julian said softly. The temperature at the table dropped 20 degrees instantly, the air growing tight, thick with unspoken threats. Viti stopped laughing. He looked at Julian, then at Sarah, observing the way Julian's body remained angled toward her, protective, fiercely possessive. Fine, Viti spat, crushing his cigar end into an ornate crystal ashtray. We accept the territory lines for now. The meeting ended abruptly, the negotiation finalized by a threat more potent than any contract. As they walked back to the armored car, Sarah felt a deep, uncontrollable trembling begin in her hands. You lied, she whispered to Julian as he efficiently buckled Leo into the specialized car seat. You told them I was his mother. Julian slammed the car door shut with unnecessary force and turned to her. He moved with sudden predatory speed, pinning her against the side of the massive SUV. He didn't touch her, but his imposing body shielded her completely from the view of Vidi's departing men. In this world, perception is everything, he murmured, his face inches from hers, his eyes dark and burning. If they think you are just help, they will target you to get to me. If they think you are mine, they will hesitate. Am I? Sarah breathed, the question escaping on a ragged sigh. Yours. Julian stared at her lips. For a second, the tension was unbearable, a raw, magnetic impulse pulling them together. She thought for certain he was going to kiss her. Get in the car, Sarah, he rasped, pulling away abruptly. The moment shattered. The drive home was silent, but it wasn't the awkward silence of before. It was a loaded silence, filled with the dangerous things left unsaid. The proximity of death, the weight of a powerful lie, and the sudden, undeniable spark between them. When they arrived back at the estate, the sun was sinking below the horizon, painting the long driveway in shades of bruised purple and orange. The gates opened automatically, but as they drove up the winding path, Marco, Julian's driver, slammed on the brakes so hard Sarah was thrown forward. Ambush! Marco screamed, his voice strained. Glass shattered. A heavy-caliber bullet took out the entire armored windshield, missing the driver's head by mere inches. Get down! Julian roared, his instinct immediate and savage. He threw his large body over Sarah and the baby seat in the back. Chaos erupted. The SUV was being pounded by continuous, heavy fire from the tree line that bordered the driveway. The armored plating held against the heavy rounds, but the noise was deafening, metallic thunder inside the enclosed space. Leo started screaming, a piercing sound of absolute terror. Marco, drive, Julian commanded. Tires are blown, boss. Marco yelled back, already drawing a concealed weapon. We run. Julian looked at Sarah. His face was bleeding from a shard of glass, a thin crimson line tracking down his cheek, but his eyes were sharp, focused entirely on survival. Listen to me. When I open this door, you run for the front porch. Do not look back. Do not stop. I will cover you. What about you? Sarah cried, clutching Leo tightly to her chest. I am the target, Julian said grimly. They won't shoot you if they have a clear shot at me. He pulled a heavy handgun from a holster beneath his jacket. The transformation was complete. He no longer resembled a powerful businessman. He looked like a highly trained soldier, cold and efficient. Go. Julian kicked the heavy door open and rolled out of the vehicle, firing immediately into the darkened trees. Sarah didn't think. She grabbed Leo and sprinted. She ran through the sharp gravel, her heels sinking uselessly, her breath tearing raggedly at her lungs. Gunshots popped behind her. Crack, 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 mingled with the shouts of men. She heard Julian roaring tactical orders to his security team, who were pouring out of the house like an angry swarm. She reached the massive, heavy oak front doors just as Marco's men pulled them inward. She tumbled inside, collapsing onto the cool, unforgiving marble floor, clutching Leo desperately. Secure the house, someone shouted. Sarah scrambled back onto her feet, running immediately toward a window. She had to see. Outside, the driveway had become a blinding war zone, filled with smoke and flashing muzzle lights. She spotted Julian. He was standing behind the SUV, reloading his weapon with practiced, horrifying ease. He wasn't hiding, he was advancing, drawing the fire. Then she saw it. A man in black tactical gear had flanked the car, moving silently through the shadows. He was aiming a rifle directly at Julian's exposed back. Julian! Sarah screamed, a desperate, silent plea that died against the bulletproof glass. But Julian Moretti possessed instincts that bordered on the supernatural. He spun around, raising his gun instantly, and fired 3 times in quick succession. The assassin dropped, a black smear on the gravel. But another shadow moved, not toward Julian, but toward the house, toward the side entrance, the door that led directly into the kitchen. The very door Sarah had unlocked earlier that afternoon to let in fresh air while she was baking cookies. She had forgotten to lock it again. Terror, cold and absolute, flooded her system. The kitchen, she whispered, the realization stealing her breath. She looked around. The guards were all outside or reinforcing the front entrance. Sarah looked at Leo, whose face was buried in her shoulder. She spotted a heavy antique porcelain vase resting on the hallway table. She gently placed Leo down behind a large marble statue, obscuring him completely. "Stay quiet," she begged the crying baby. She grabbed the vase. She kicked off her useless heels. And she ran toward the kitchen. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't a killer. But she was a mother. And someone was coming into her house to hurt her children. Sarah Bennett disappeared into the dark hallway just as the kitchen door handle began to turn. The kitchen was shrouded in oppressive shadows, illuminated only by the frantic flashes of gunfire tearing through the sky outside. The faint, domestic smell of burnt cookies, an innocent scent now turned sinister, hung heavy in the cold air. Sarah pressed her back against the cool granite island, her breathing shallow and ragged. In her hands, the heavy porcelain vase felt slippery with the sweat of her palms. She listened intently. The doorknob turned again. Asterisk click. The door groaned open, allowing a gust of wet, freezing wind to rush into the room. Heavy boots stepped onto the tiled floor. Asterisk thump. Thump. Asterisk the intruder moved with purpose, professional and chillingly efficient. He wasn't checking corners. He knew exactly where he was going. He was heading for the main hallway. He was heading directly toward where she had hidden Leo. Sarah's terror transmuted suddenly, cleanly, into a cold, hard rage. Asterisk not my children. Asterisk she waited until the figure passed the end of the island. He was a large man dressed head to toe in black, a suppressor attached to the pistol in his hand. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She stepped out from the shadows and swung the heavy vase with every ounce of physical strength she possessed. Asterisk crash. The porcelain connected with the back of the man's head with a sickening thud, shattering into 1,000 razor-sharp shards that scattered across the tile. The man grunted, a guttural sound of shock, and stumbled forward, dropping to one knee. Ideally, he would have been knocked unconscious, but this was a professional killer, powered by lethal adrenaline. He roared, spinning around, thick blood pouring down his neck and soaking his tactical gear. His eyes were hauled open, unfocused but furious. He raised his suppressed gun. Sarah froze, unarmed and exposed. The man smirked, his teeth stained crimson with his own blood. "Bitch," he hissed. He squeezed the trigger. Asterisk bang. The sound, even suppressed, was deafening in the enclosed space. Sarah flinched, instinctively bracing for the pain, waiting for the end. But the bullet didn't hit her. The intruder's head snapped backward as if pulled by an invisible string. He collapsed onto his back, dead before he hit the tiled floor. Standing in the doorway connecting the dining room to the kitchen was Julian. He looked like a demon rising from hell itself. His expensive tuxedo was torn, his face streaked with soot and rain and blood. He held his smoking gun with a steady, practiced hand, but his chest was heaving violently. "Sarah," he choked out, his voice raw. He took a hesitant step toward her and then stumbled badly, catching himself on the doorframe. "Julian!" Sarah rushed forward, catching him just as his knees gave way. He was massive, a dead weight against her small frame. Her hands slipped on his jacket. It was wet, but not with rain. It was warm. She pulled her hand back. It was covered in bright, viscous crimson blood. "You're shot," she gasped, the panic instantly overriding her earlier terror. Sighed, Julian gritted out, his face draining rapidly of color. "Through and through. Just missed the liver, I think." "Marco!" Sarah screamed, her voice echoing wildly through the house. "Marco, help!" Julian gripped her arm, his hold weak, trembling. "Leo, Lily, are they? They're safe. I hid them. They're safe." "Good," Julian whispered. His eyes rolled back into his head, and he slumped unconscious against her shoulder. The next hour was a blur of controlled chaos. Marco and the security team swarmed the house, securing the perimeter and cleaning up the scene with chilling speed. Paramedics, private ones operating solely on the Moretti payroll, arrived in unmarked vans. They didn't go to a public hospital where police would ask questions they wouldn't answer. They went to a private clinic in the Loop, a sterile fortress of glass and steel. Sarah refused to leave. She held Lily on one hip and kept Leo secured in his car seat carrier, pacing the waiting room floor like a caged animal. Her navy dress was ruined, stained irreparably with Julian's blood and the intruder's darker, heavier gore. She looked utterly insane, a woman teetering on the edge, but when the nurses tried to tell her to sit down, one look from her fiercely guarded eyes made them retreat immediately. She wasn't the nanny anymore. She was the survivor, the woman who had just stared down a killer in her own kitchen. For hours later, a doctor in surgical scrubs emerged, looking exhausted. "Miss Bennett, how is he?" Sarah demanded, stepping forward instantly, her voice dangerously steady. "He lost a lot of blood," the doctor said gravely. "The bullet nicked an artery, causing significant internal bleeding. But he is immensely strong. We've stabilized him. He's in recovery." Sarah let out a slow, trembling breath she felt she'd been holding since the first bullet shattered the windshield. Her legs gave out, and she sank onto the nearest waiting room chair, pulling Lily onto her lap for support. "Can I see him? He's heavily sedated. He needs rest." "I didn't ask what he needs," Sarah said, her voice shaking but absolutely firm. "I asked if I can see him." The doctor looked to Marco, who was standing guard by the door, radiating silent menace. Marco gave a subtle, decisive nod. 5 minutes, the doctor conceded. Sarah walked into the dimly lit room. Julian looked smaller in the stark hospital bed, stripped of his custom suits and his psychological armor. He was pale, a pale field of white against the sheets, wires and tubes connecting him to monitors that beeped in a steady, reassuring rhythm. She walked to the bedside. She didn't cry. She reached out and took his hand. It was rough, calloused, the hand of a man who worked hard and fought harder, but now it felt lifeless. "You can't die," she whispered fiercely, gripping his hand tight. "You promised me no one would break my toaster. You promised Lily a stable home. You don't get to quit now." She squeezed his hand, and faintly, weakly, she felt a distinct squeeze back. 3 days later, they were moved to a safe house. It was a penthouse overlooking the Chicago River, completely off the books. A sterile, silent fortress. The windows were bulletproof. The elevator required a retinal scan. And the fridge was fully stocked with gourmet food. Julian was recovering with a speed that seemed to defy medical science. He was already sitting up, propped against satin pillows, working intensely on a laptop, ignoring every one of the doctor's orders to rest. But the atmosphere in the penthouse was suffocatingly tense. Sarah was in the kitchen making tea. She watched Julian through the open living room door. He was talking low and dangerously to Marco. "Find out how they knew," Julian was saying, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The kitchen door, the timing. They knew exactly when the shift change was. They knew I was taking the armored SUV, not the sedan. That was an inside job." "We're scrubbing the comms, boss," Marco said, his face grim. "We found a burner phone on the shooter in the kitchen. We're decrypting it now." Sarah walked in with the tea tray. She set the 2 mugs down on the glass table. Julian looked up at her. His eyes softened slightly, a momentary break in the severity, but the tension in his jaw remained taut. "You should be resting," she said quietly. "I can't rest while there is a rat in my house," Julian replied. "Maybe it wasn't a rat," Sarah offered. "Maybe they just got lucky." "There is no luck in this business, Sarah. Only strategy and betrayal." Just then, Marco's tablet pinged loudly. He looked down at the screen, and his face instantly went white. He looked up at Julian, then quickly at Sarah, then back at the tablet as if confirming a nightmare. "What?" Julian barked, leaning forward painfully. "Boss, the burner phone. The last call received. It wasn't from one of our guys." "Who was it?" Marco swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. It was from a registered number. A prepaid cell found in the possession of Gary Bennett. The room fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. The air was sucked out of the luxurious penthouse. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her chilled and dizzy. "What?" "Your ex-husband," Julian said. His voice deadly calm, devoid of accusation, only cold calculation. "He sold us out." "No." Sarah shook her head violently. "Gary is a gambler. He's a loser. But he's not. He doesn't know anything about you. How could he know the layout, the schedule?" Julian slowly turned his gaze to Lily, who was sitting quietly in the corner of the room, playing with a tower of wooden blocks. "Visitation," Julian said softly, the single word ringing with terrifying finality. Sarah felt profoundly sick. "Lily," Julian called out gently. The little girl looked up, her innocent gaze settling on the handsome man she adored. "Yes, Mr. Julian. When you saw your daddy last week, did he play a game with you? Did he ask you about the house?" Lily nodded enthusiastically, a joyful smile on her face. "Yes, we played spy. He asked me to draw a map of the castle. He wanted to know where the Sleeping Beauty slept and where the guards stood. He said he was going to send me a surprise." Sarah clamped a hand over her mouth, muffling a strangled sob. The betrayal was so intimate, so absolute, it physically hurt. Her ex-husband had used their daughter, their 4-year-old child, to draw a map for assassins. He had sold their lives, Lily's life, to pay off his miserable gambling debts. "Oh my God!" Sarah wept, the horror crushing her. "It's my fault. I let him see her. I brought this danger to your door." She turned to run, to hide, to simply leave. She couldn't stay here. She was the leak. She was the danger. "Sarah." Julian's voice cracked like a whip. He winced sharply as he forced himself up from the couch, ignoring the blinding pain in his side. He crossed the room in 3 strides and grabbed her arm, spinning her around forcefully. "Let me go," she sobbed, struggling weakly. "I have to leave. I'm a danger to you." "You are not going anywhere," Julian growled, pulling her closer. His good hand cupped her face, forcing her to look directly into his eyes. "This is not your fault. This is the act of a desperate, evil man. Do not take his sin and make it yours." "But he used her. He used you, and he will pay for it," Julian vowed, the darkness in his eyes terrifying, yet directed entirely outward. "He thinks he sold me out to Vidi, but all he did was sign his own death warrant." "I can't stay," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Look at this life, Julian. Guns, blood, my daughter drawing maps for killers. I can't do this." "You can," Julian said, his voice dropping to a seductive, low whisper as his thumb brushed away a tear on her cheek. "Because you are the strongest person I have ever met. You walked into a pitch-black kitchen with nothing but a vase to fight a professional hitman. You saved my son. You saved me. I was terrified," she admitted, her breath catching. "Fear doesn't make you weak. It makes you smart." He looked down at her lips. The emotional and physical distance between them vanished entirely. The coiled adrenaline, the raw fear, the profound relief. It all culminated in this single, intense moment. Julian lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was desperate, acclaiming. It tasted of the burnt tea, of residual danger, and of a dangerous, potent promise. Sarah froze for one heartbeat, and then she melted into him completely. She wrapped her arms around his neck, careful to avoid his bandaged side, and held on as if he were the only solid, unmoving thing in a world that had suddenly started spinning. When they pulled apart, both of them breathless, Julian rested his forehead against hers. "You are not the nanny," he rasped. "Not anymore. You are mine, and I protect what is mine." "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked, a flicker of fear for Gary, despite everything, still lingering. Not because she loved him, but because he was Lily's father. Julian's eyes hardened, turning to obsidian. "I'm going to finish the custody battle tonight." The midnight air in Chicago's decaying meatpacking district was thick enough to choke on. It smelled of old rust, melting ice, and the metallic tang of the nearby train tracks. The warehouse Julian had chosen was an unassuming, forbidding brick relic from the 1920s, a place where echoes lasted longer than they should. The black armored sedan rolled to a quiet stop on the cracked pavement. Rain was beginning to fall again, a freezing sleet that coated the world in shades of relentless gray. Inside the car, the silence was impossibly heavy. Sarah Bennett sat in the back seat next to Julian. He was pale, his movements stiff and heavily guarded due to the recent bullet wound in his side, but his eyes were burning with a terrifying, cold resolve. He checked his watch, a complicated Patek Philippe that cost more than the entire abandoned building they were parked in front of. "You don't have to go in there," Julian said, his voice low and gravelly, like grinding gears. He didn't look at her. He was watching the warehouse door. "Marco can handle the paperwork. You don't need to see him like this." Sarah smoothed the lapel of her trench coat. Her hands were trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from a potent cocktail of rage and adrenaline. "He used my daughter to draw a map for your assassins, Julian. He put a target on a 4-year-old's back. If I don't look him in the eye when this ends, I'll never truly be free of him." Julian turned his head slowly. He studied her profile, seeing the new, cold steel that had forged itself in her spine over the last 48 hours. He nodded once, a gesture of supreme, lethal respect. "Then let's finish it." They exited the car. Marco and 2 other immense guards were already waiting by the heavy steel sliding door. Marco looked grim. He nodded once to Julian, then heaved the door upward. It rattled violently on its tracks, revealing a cavernous, dimly lit space, overwhelming in its size. In the center of the vast concrete floor sat a single plain wooden chair. And in that chair, bound tightly by industrial-strength zip ties, sat Gary Bennett. Gary looked nothing like the arrogant man who had routinely sneered at Sarah in family court. His expensive leather jacket was torn and soaked with rainwater. His left eye was swollen completely shut, purple and angry, and his lip was badly split. He was shivering violently, sweat beading on his forehead despite the freezing temperature of the warehouse. When he saw them, he practically convulsed against the restraints. "Sarah," Gary choked out, spitting blood onto the concrete floor. "Sarah, baby, thank God. Tell them. Tell these psychopaths who I am. It was a misunderstanding, sir. I didn't know." Sarah walked into the cone of light, her heels clicking rhythmically on the concrete floor, the sound echoing like a precise ticking clock. She stopped 5 feet from him. She looked at the man she had once promised to love and cherish, the man who had systematically destroyed her confidence for years, and who had just tried to sell her life. "You didn't know?" Sarah asked, her voice dangerously, terrifyingly quiet. "No, I swear," Gary blubbered, his eyes darting wildly to Julian, who was leaning heavily on a black cane in the deep shadows, utterly still. "Vidi, his guys, they told me they just wanted to talk to him. They said they wanted to scare him into a business deal. They promised no one would get hurt." "You're lying," Julian said. He stepped forward, the tap of his cane on the concrete floor sounding ominously loud. "We recovered the audio from the burner phone, Gary. We heard the recording." Julian pulled a small digital recorder from his pocket and pressed play. Gary's voice, tiny and distinct, filled the vast space of the warehouse. "The nursery is in the east wing, second door on the left. The guards change at 6 p.m. That's your window. Just make sure I get the 50 grand by morning." The recording clicked off, and the silence returned, heavier than before. Gary slumped in the chair, the color draining from his face until he looked precisely like a living corpse. "You told them where the nursery was," Sarah whispered. The rage she felt wasn't hot. It was cold. Absolute zero. "You didn't just sell out Julian. You pointed a gun at $50,000 for Lily's life. That was the calculus. That was her value to him. Less than a high-stakes weekend in Vegas. A couple of hands of reckless poker," Julian added, his voice like grinding stone. Gary was completely broken now, a puddle of mucus and tears. "I was in too deep, Sarah. You don't understand. They were going to shatter my kneecaps. They were going to snap my femurs," he wailed, his breath ragged. the snot freezing on his chin. I had no choice. We all have choices, Gary, Julian stated, the ultimate judge, standing motionless beside the mahogany table. He gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod toward Marco. Marco, who moved with the lethal grace of a predator, stepped forward and deposited a thick manila folder directly into Sarah's hands. What is this? Gary whimpered, his eyes fixed on the offensive neutrality of the cardboard. Your exit strategy, Julian delivered, leaning slightly on his cane. Or perhaps your death warrant. It depends entirely on how you utilize the next 60 seconds of your miserable existence. Sarah opened the folder. The crisp, expensive paper rustled slightly. Inside lay a meticulously crafted legal document, drafted by the priciest, most ruthless litigation attorneys in Chicago, the kind of law money bought, not justice. It was a complete, final, and irrevocable surrender of all parental rights concerning Lily. Sarah's hands were perfectly steady as she held the document up. The timid uncertainty that had once defined her was gone, replaced by granite. You are going to sign this, Sarah commanded, her voice steady, low, and devoid of any discernible emotion. A perfect mirror of Julian. You will grant me sole legal and physical custody of Lily. You will waive every right to visitation, forever. You will petition the state to remove your name from her original birth certificate. You will be erased, a stranger to your daughter. Gary stared blankly at the dense legalese. And if I do that, then you let me leave? Then we leave, Julian interjected, confirming the terms. Marco already has your transportation voucher. A one-way ticket straight to Tucson, Arizona. You will board that bus and you will never set foot in Illinois again. If you breathe the air of Chicago, if you attempt to contact Sarah or the girl in any way, the police receive the recording of your treason and my associates. He paused, letting the implication hang heavy in the air. We'll take care of the rest of you. Gary looked at the engraved pen Marco held out for him. He looked at the heavy-caliber handgun holstered securely on Marco's hip. He looked into Julian's eyes, cold and dark as volcanic glass. Then he fixed his gaze on Sarah, desperately searching for even a sliver of the fearful, timid woman he had effortlessly manipulated and bullied for years. He found only an impenetrable wall of unforgiving stone. Sarah, please, he whimpered, a final, pitiful attempt at emotional manipulation. She's my little girl, my flesh and blood. She stopped being your little girl the second you drew that crude map for the men coming to extinguish her life, Sarah responded, her voice cutting through his pathetic plea like a razor. Sign the papers, Gary. It is the only fragment of mercy you are going to find in this room or ever again in your life. With a visible, uncontrollable tremor, Gary grasped the pen. He wept openly, great, racking sobs that shook his entire body, as he scrawled his signature across the designated dotted line. His tears instantly blooming dark, irregular stains on the legal paper. The second the pen lifted, Marco's hand shot forward, snatching the documents away with proprietary speed. He meticulously inspected the signature against the light, then gave a sharp, decisive nod to Julian. It is done. Get him out of my sight, Julian commanded, turning his back, dismissing Gary's existence entirely. Gary was violently hauled to his feet. As he was dragged toward the back exit, he twisted his neck for one last look, but Sarah was already moving away, gliding toward the front door without a backward glance. She didn't watch him leave. He was already irrelevant, a ghost. Outside, the incessant, cleansing rain had finally abated. The city air, washed clean by the storm, felt unusually crisp and sharp. Sarah leaned heavily against the glossy black sedan, clutching the manila folder like a talisman against her chest. She felt dangerously lightheaded. The massive surge of adrenaline was rapidly crashing, leaving her profoundly weak, her knees trembling beneath her dress. "Are you all right?" Julian asked. He stood exceptionally close, his large frame acting as an immediate, solid shield against the sudden gust of cold wind whipping down the street. "I don't know," Sarah admitted truthfully, rubbing her temples. She looked up at him, The harsh reflections of the sodium streetlights danced deep within his dark, impenetrable eyes. I feel profoundly lighter, as if a great weight has been lifted, but I also feel utterly terrified. Gary is gone, yes, but the threat remains. Vidi is still out there, isn't he? Vidi will be handled, Julian confirmed, his tone utterly devoid of nuance, leaving no doubt as to the finality of that promise. But the danger you feel now, it is inherent to my world, Sarah. I told you this up front. Now that Gary is permanently removed, you have a critical choice. He gently gestured toward the folder she held. You have the check I gave you, sufficient funds to never worry again. You have full, uncontested custody. You can take Lily and vanish anywhere in the world you desire. Paris, London, a quiet, forgotten town in Vermont where no one has ever heard the name Moretti. I will arrange absolute, secure protection for you from afar. You can finally have what you always wanted. A normal life. Sarah gazed first at the folder, the blueprint for safety and anonymity, and then at the man standing stoically before her. She took a moment to reflect on the normal life she had desperately chased before the struggle. A life defined by relentless loneliness, crushing anxiety, and the ever-present fear of crushing poverty. But then her mind flashed back over the last month. The unexpected, tender way Julian watched Leo play. The primal instinct with which he had thrown his own body over hers in the driveway during the shooting. The unrestrained, joyful sound of Lily's laughter echoing through the secluded garden. Safety, she realized with stark clarity, wasn't a matter of geography or distance. It was fundamentally about who was standing beside you when the world tried to fall apart. Sarah closed the small distance between them, stepping firmly into his personal space. She reached out and placed her hand with profound tenderness over the hidden bandage on his side, where the bullet had torn his flesh. Leo needs a mother, she whispered, her voice husky. Julian involuntarily flinched, a sharp, choked breath hitching in his chest, a rare display of vulnerability. And Lily needs something more profound, Sarah continued, her voice gaining resonant strength, refusing to back down. She needs a father who keeps his solemn promises, a father who protects her fiercely, not one who sells her out to cover his gambling debts. She lifted her chin, meeting his dark eyes directly, seeing the raw vulnerability he meticulously concealed from the entire world. And I, she finished simply, don't want a normal life, Julian. I want a real life, and I want it with you. Julian let out a deep, ragged breath, the sound heavy with relief and shock, and released his expensive walking cane. It clattered loudly onto the wet pavement, entirely forgotten. He wrapped his powerful arms around her, pulling her against him with desperate devotion, burying his face deep into the sweet-smelling crook of her neck, inhaling her essence as if she were the only clean air left in his polluted existence. Then you have me, he vowed, his voice vibrating deeply against her skin. Every scarred, broken, and devoted part of me, until the final day I draw breath. They remained there in the quiet, damp street, a newly single mother and a powerful Mafia capo, bound not by a legal contract but by shared blood, undeniable chemistry, and a silent promise that proved infinitely stronger than any signed document. The late afternoon sun drenched the massive Moretti estate in a warm, forgiving golden glow. The towering stone walls and the imposing wrought iron gates still stood guard, but the atmosphere inside had undergone a fundamental transformation. The mausoleum-like silence of the manor was decisively vanquished, replaced by the beautiful, messy, chaotic sounds of abundant life. The sprawling back garden was festooned with vibrant streamers and cheerfully inflated balloons. It was Leo's second birthday celebration, and the guest list was wonderfully eclectic. Massive, burly security guards awkwardly balanced tiny paper party hats on their heads, delicately sipping sweet fruit punch from plastic cups. The usually stiff French private chef, Monsieur Dubois, was surprisingly down on his knees in the clipped grass, roaring with laughter as Lily, now 5 years old and sporting an endearing gap where her 2 front teeth used to be, proudly displayed a large, shiny beetle she had discovered. Sarah stood on the cool stone terrace balcony, looking down at the joyful spectacle below. She was wearing a simple, pale yellow sundress that gently fluttered in the afternoon breeze. Her hand rested instinctively, protectively, upon her stomach, where a small, almost imperceptible bump hinted at the newest addition to the burgeoning family, expected to arrive in 6 short months. She felt a familiar presence behind her, utterly warm and reassuringly solid. Julian stepped up, instantly wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. He rested his chin on the crest of her shoulder, his cheek pressing gently against hers. He wasn't wearing one of his usual perfectly tailored, imposing suits today. He was dressed simply in a comfortable linen shirt, the sleeves casually rolled to his elbows, making him look noticeably younger, lighter, and more accessible. "They're genuinely happy," he murmured, his gaze fixed on Leo, who was executing a wobbly, triumphant run across the lawn, giggling madly while chasing a clumsy, golden retriever puppy they had named Barnaby. "We're happy," Sarah corrected him softly, leaning back fully into the unconditional safety of his embrace. "Did you ever truly think?" Julian asked quietly, the memory returning. "That day in the restaurant, when you marched directly up to my table and demanded custody of my son. Did you imagine it would ever end like this?" Sarah smiled, a gentle, profound recollection of the raw fear, the pouring rain, and the relentless screaming of an abandoned baby. "I didn't think at all," she admitted. "I simply heard a baby crying out for help, and I saw a father who possessed endless power but utterly lacked the courage or knowledge of how to ask for it." Julian gently turned her around within the circle of his arms. The cold, sharp angles that had once defined his face had softened beautifully over the past year. The Arctic ice that had previously encased his dark eyes had fully melted into an expression of intense warmth, devotion, and profound peace. "You didn't just stop the crying, Sarah?" he whispered, tenderly brushing a stray strand of hair away from her face. "You woke me up from a lifetime of darkness. You saved us all. I intend to keep saving you," she teased him back softly, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Every single day. And I will spend the rest of my life making absolutely sure you never, for a single second, regret this choice." He lowered his head and kissed her then, a slow, deep, consuming kiss beneath the golden sun, surrounded by the exuberant, innocent laughter of their children. The perpetual war outside the high walls would always exist, an unavoidable element of his legacy. But inside the Moretti estate, they had painstakingly built something utterly sacred and unbreakable. The crying had finally stopped. The true living had begun.